Uh, I'm very excited to introduce tonight's speaker. I shall do that in just a moment. But first of all, the usual preliminaries. I want to say thank you to Anne, as so often, for a really wonderful and seasonally appropriate collection of slides tonight. What a lovely set of pictures, whetting all our appetites, I'm sure, for getting out there and having a look at some of these things in reality and not just on the screen. Jeff, in a very eagle-eyed way, has spotted a mistake on one of the slides. There was a slide advertising a forthcoming trip to Bempton Cliffs, which was advertised as being on Saturday, March the 23rd, but actually it's a Thursday. It is March the 23rd, but that's a Thursday. So sorry if anybody was a bit confused by that, but the event will be going ahead on Thursday, March the 23rd, just for clarification. I expect most of you know the drill. What will happen is we'll hear the talk from our speaker shortly. That will be followed directly by the question and answer session. And in order to make that question and answer session just a little bit more sort of efficient, it would be great if you could write your questions in the Q&A as they occur to you during the talk. Then Jeff will be able to organise them into a sensible order and ask them in the right kind of way. And now it's time to introduce our speaker. We're very, very lucky to have her. It's Jackie Harris. Jackie works and has worked at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust for 7 years, where she's managed a £6 million heritage lottery project at Slimbridge. Along the way, she's developed a really passionate interest in the Trust's work to save wetland species and the habitats they rely on as well, of course. She sent in a lovely quote. She says, "I've never worked anywhere else that has such a powerful belief in what it does and is so fully committed to doing it, no matter how difficult it might seem." So that's some words of real passionate endorsement of the work of the Wetland and Wildlife Trust. I'm sure many of you have been to their reserves, perhaps also been to Slimbridge even. Just a little bit of background. The Trust was set up by Sir Peter Scott in 1946. Some of you might know that already. In the heart of Gloucestershire, and it's a world leader in wetland research and in the species that depend upon them. And we're going to hear from Jackie tonight about what some of those species are. So without further ado, I shall hand over to her. Jackie, very much looking forward to it.
Thank you, Helen. And thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me along. So I've just got to switch to my screen now so that I know that you're getting it. Can somebody just let me know whether that's showing okay?
That's good. Thanks, Jackie.
Excellent. It's a good start. So let's start with some swans. Why not? And I will say a little bit more about these birds as we get into the talk, because this is the Buick swans. They're a major part of the Slimbridge story and have been for 60 years this year, actually. 60 years this year. That's right. They share a birthday with me in terms of the studies that Peter Scott did with them. So I'm going to hang on. There was a little bit of stalling when I first get started because for some reason my slides aren't switching over.
Just give it a moment, Jackie, and if it doesn't, maybe just try stop sharing.
Yeah, and start again. We didn't try this, Jeff, did we, when we were practicing to make sure my slides actually work? Bear with everybody. I'm just going to just restart that because something's clearly got stuck. I won't be a moment. It usually works in the end. So let's hope this is going to work now.
Otherwise, your task is 45 minutes on swans.
Yeah, it is. Yes, I hope it isn't going to be that. I've never had this problem before. Nothing happening at all. I'm going to come out again and I'm going to reload this. I'm so sorry. It won't take a minute. So Can you see that?
Not yet.
Right, okay. Can you see that?
Still not yet.
No. What you could do, Jackie, I mean, this will take 5 minutes or so, but you could email the, is it a PowerPoint? What,
Yeah, it is. I've never
um,
had this problem before. I'm just going to give it one more go, Helen, because honestly, this normally does not happen. So something
Yeah,
has
no.
happened, I think.
I'd suggest maybe, Jackie, just try starting at the next slide and see if it was just something hung up on that first one.
Yeah.
If you can. If you have it ready on the second one, and then
Sorry, folks.
still got
Is that working?
we're one further on, yeah.
Yes, it's working now. I
Just
can
try
go
on to
for
the
it.
next. Yeah, we're good.
Thank you ever so much. Sorry,
Okay.
sorry for the slight delay there, folks. So
Okay.
just by way of introduction to me, as Helen said, I've been at the Trust for 7 years, but actually I don't work there anymore. I now volunteer giving these sorts of talks, and also for my sins on a Wednesday, I go out on reserve at Slimbridge, which is a very physical bit of volunteering, but I love it, which is essentially about creating habitats for all of our wild birds. But I love what I do so much that I come out and give talks like this. So as Helen said, we were set up 76 years ago by Peter Scott. I've only got a few slides that are words, but it's worth setting the context, I think, really, because we are a really small charity. In global terms, we are tiny. So we're 450 staff. And that's at 10 sites in the UK. So we've got 10 visitor centres around the UK, all working on wild birds principally, but 7 of those also hold collection birds, so birds that are sort of rare in the UK. We also have 2 international sites, and one of those I'm going to talk about tonight. And then we've got 1,000 volunteers across all of our sites internationally and across our 10 sites in the UK. And of course, I am one of those. And we are all about wetland nature that thrives and enriches lives. We certainly started our life as a wildfowl charity, and that was Peter Scott's ambition, was to collect wildfowl and also restore, dwindling numbers of wildfowl for species that were in trouble. We are much more now focused on the wetlands as a way of saving all the species that depend on them, and that won't be any surprise to you given the interest you have in nature and all of their habitats. We are certainly the world's experts on wetlands, and if we're not the number one, we're certainly in the top 2. In the UK, we probably are best known for our 10 visitor sites, but internationally, we're far better known for our conservation work and for the work we do around the world to protect flyways and to protect habitats. And of course, those 2 are very linked. Some of the important stuff, I said that we were all about wetlands, principally as a way of saving wetland nature. It is true that 90% of all the world's wetlands have been lost. And in fact, that's in the UK, it's about 30% in the last 50 years. It's really accelerated in the UK in the last 30 years. Having said that, some of our biggest wetlands like Martin Mere and of course the whole of Fenland pretty much were drained down a very long time ago. Why does that matter to humans? Well, for us, wetlands are the place where fresh water is stored. Globally, about 3% of all water on the planet is fresh water. Of that, broadly, about 1% is in clouds, tied up at any one time, and in ice caps. About 1% is so far underground or so poisoned by human activity that it's unusable. And about 1% is still usable as a freshwater resource for us and everything else that lives on the planet. So it's pretty grim reading, really, that 90% of our wetlands have gone when we so vitally need fresh water. Interestingly, and we're really learning more about this as we think about wetlands as a place to store carbon. We now know, because we've got a huge site at Steert, which is on the North Somerset coast, which we reinstated as a salt marsh in 2014. And in those first years of it being reinstated as a salt marsh, we've had Manchester University there doing lots of studies, and they've been able to tell us that in those first 4 years, that 500 hectares, it's just under 500 hectares of salt marsh, has stored the equivalent of 2 million trees growing for 10 years. I'll say that again, just 500 hectares, 2 million trees growing for 5 years. So that's a lot of carbon storage. I am also a Woodland Trust member, so don't for 1 minute think I'm saying that trees don't matter, because they do. But in the right conditions, salt marsh is absolutely the best way to, and fastest way to store carbon. And of course, you know, we all know about how important peat bogs are for that. One of the things that people are often surprised about, and I'm sure this doesn't apply to you and your members, is that wetlands are really important for flood management. You know, they slow down flood water. They slow down particularly flash flood water. You know, they're good places to hold water when it comes really fast and really suddenly. And of course, lots of wetland areas are natural sponges. Really, they soak up a lot of water. So not only are they good at stopping flash flooding, but they're also good at reducing drought, because they are naturally holding water. So when we lose them, we speed up the threat of drought and flash flooding, which is already increased because the atmosphere is so much more energetic than it was, you know, even 100 years ago. And lastly, it's good for our health. And if COVID taught us nothing else, you will all know this: getting outside is really good for our health. And I was thinking, if I'm taking anybody for a walk across a field and there happens to be a pond there, it's magnetic. It's a bit like going to a bonfire. There's something about water that draws us. Walking across a field with a pond, everyone wants to walk to the pond. There is something magical about the reflections and the wildlife there. So it's good for our health. And the last thing to say on here, I've got one or two more wordy slides, is that every species on the planet has evolved to live in a very specific environment except us, and we change nearly every habitat to suit us, and wetlands are no different, sadly. So what do? Well, as a trust, we restore wetlands both at home and abroad. I'm going to walk you through a little bit about the work we do with these 4 species. They're not by any means the only 4 species we work with, but they're quite a nice mix, and one of them's a UK species. So I thought it was a nice way to walk you through some of the work we do and how that has an impact for people and for wildfowl, birds and other wildlife across the world. And the other thing we do is we're constantly looking to provide the right research and evidence for governments and non-governmental organisations to get them behind us. And some of our recent successes, you might have seen that in the last couple of weeks, Europe has actually banned lead shot over wetland areas, thankfully, and we've been a really big part of that. So to the pictures, because this is always nice, the nice bit about any slideshow. I'm going to start with the Buick Swan. So so there we are, Buick Swan. And one of the things to notice about the Buick Swan, if you don't know it already, it's not like our mute swans. This is a much smaller swan with a very distinctive black and yellow bill pattern there. Very similar looking to the Hooper swan, but slightly smaller and slightly different the way they hold their neck. But this is a species that's been coming to Slimbridge in some numbers since the hard winter of 1963-1964. And it was in that winter that Peter Scott, sitting in the big window of his house overlooking the Rushy Pen, which is his favourite lake at Slimbridge, he started noticing with his young daughter Daffodil that he could identify the birds by their facial patterns. So much like we've got a thumbprint, he was an artist by profession, although he was very, obviously well known for setting up the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust and indeed the Worldwide Fund for Nature. His actual job was as an artist, and that's how he made his money and how he supported a lot of the work at Slimbridge, and then later on at other sites around the UK, was paying for it through his paintings, basically. But whilst he's looking at these birds and he's recognizing their facial patterns, what he also was able to identify was the relationships between some of the birds. So this is a page, actually, this is a page from February 1964. So just when he's first starting to see these birds and realize that he knows the individuals, what you've got in there is a selection of birds with some of their signets. So the grey ones, as you'll probably know, are the signets. When he's watching them in that winter, what he's realizing is he can recognize some of the adults. Some of them have got signets with them. They don't yet have their fully formed and fixed adult markings yet. But he also realized that there were some teenage young adults hanging around with certain adults that were clearly there with cygnets. So just to make that clear, adults have got there very young with them, and what he realized, they've also got their yearlings with them, basically. So the yearlings are a bit more confident, but they're definitely sticking with the parents. And from that, what he's able to identify is he can see the parents and the offspring. And from that, over the last 60 years, we've been able to identify the relationships between pretty much all the birds that have come on our site, of which there are around 10,000 now over the last 60 years. So we know all the aunties, uncles, grandparents, sons, daughters, cousins, nephews, whatever it might be. So we've got these family trees that we've been able to build up. It's an astonishing study, and it's been useful in all kinds of ways. We know what are some of the stronger families, the families that have clearly got strong, good DNA, because they've got aged birds that keep coming back over and over. We can see those family lines, but we can also tell who's missing, and also understand the relationships between the birds. What we do know is that they are very, very faithful to their partners. I think we've had one proper divorce and a couple of infidelities over our 60 years, and one of those infidelities was simply because a female came with the wrong male one year. He never came back. We thought he was dead, and then she obviously found him when she went back to Russia, and reunited with him and came back with her first partner the next year. So they are very faithful. And there they are in flight on their way back into Slimbridge. One of the things that we're very active in, and of course the last couple of years have been, well, the last 3 years now have been quite odd because of COVID, but we are traditionally very active in going out to Russia in the summer. This is where the birds go for their summer breeding. It's 24-hour-a-day daylight, brilliant grasses, everything's very lush. They lay their eggs, and within 3 months, those tiny cygnets are ready to fly back to Slimbridge or back on their travel west to get away from the Russian cold. It's certainly true that they'd rather spend their winters knee deep in cold water at Slimbridge than under snow in the Russian tundra. Of course, our work in Russia has been very much interrupted by COVID and now the Russian war with Ukraine. But this is a picture of where we would traditionally go in Russia. This is a place called Kaboyka. We normally go out there every year to do a swan count, to catch some of them and weigh them, measure them, make sure they're fit and healthy, ring any that aren't ringed. And of course, there are lots that aren't ringed, although we do have a massive collection of birds that are ringed. And I've got a picture here of Dave Painter, who's our reserve warden at Slimbridge, and Kane McBride. They're working on the swan catch in the middle of the Russian tundra. What they're doing there is putting the swans into swan jackets. Those green jackets pretty much disable the swans temporarily. I can't say the swans like being caught, but once they're in a swan jacket and they can't flap about or run around, they certainly calm down. And I think you can probably see that in the picture. They're not looking too harassed, really. But this is a really important part of what we do. We want to make sure that they're fit and healthy. They've got nice fat bottoms, so they've got enough energy to make the journey back. And of course, that bill pattern in relation to their Darvik ring, so that we know exactly what the facial pattern is of individual birds. A lot of the time we won't see that ring, but we might see that face. So, and the other way around. So we try and get a record of both. But sadly, Buick swans are facing some real problems, and it's always sad to show this slide, but I kind of feel I'm doing a disservice if I don't show it. So the big white blobs there, you probably guessed, are lead shot, but the ones that are ringed are little bits of shot that have broken off, and it's also little bits of bone that have broken off. So this is sadly typical of 30% of the birds that we get back to Slimbridge. We do a swan catch every year. We x-ray a proportion of them, and what we know is that 3 in 10 have already been hit by lead shot somewhere along their journey. Now that might be lead shot they've been carrying for several years, but the important point about it is that somebody is shooting them. What we know is that it's actually mostly Russian hunters who are shooting them. I have to talk about pre-COVID and pre-war, really, about what we would normally be doing in Russia, because we work very hard with Russian hunters to get them to understand that they can't shoot Buick swans. It's against all international law. They can shoot hooper swans for food. I should emphasize that they are not primarily shooting for sport. They do shoot for food. And far be it from us to say you have to go hungry. We just want them to shoot the right things. So we've been doing quite a lot of work. You don't need to read the detail of this slide at all, but this is all in Russian anyway, so you can't read it. Most of you, well, some of you might be able to, but very few will. But these are the kinds of things that we've had made and shared with all Russian hunting groups along the Buick swans flyways, so that they know what birds they're allowed to shoot and which ones they aren't. And in tandem with that, we give them which I haven't got a slide of actually, but a silhouetted image of what the bird looks like from the ground, so they've got an idea of whether they're aiming at a Buick swan or a hooper swan, because whilst they look very similar facially, there are some differences you can spot from the ground. So that's one of the things we're doing to try and stop the decline of Buick swans, because on this flyway, the numbers are down by 30% in the last 30 years. And we know we used to get 600 birds through a winter at Slimbridge. This year we've got 128, and that's been about the same number for the last 2 or 3 years. When I first started at Slimbridge, it was 138. So the numbers are still going down. What we want to do is halt that decline, and if we can, turn that decline so they start going up again. So one of the things is working with Russian hunters, but as I said, the last 3 years have made that much more difficult, and we can't get to Russia. We can't fund anything in Russia, quite understandably. So we have to put this work on hold for now. The other thing we've been doing, you might have seen this on television. Sasha Dench, who worked with us, she's now actually got her own charity, Conservation Without Borders, doing very similar work. But Sasha, who's a completely mad woman in terms of what she's prepared to do for conservation and for wildlife. She has got so much courage. She worked with the trust and went out to the Russian tundra. It was one September. I'm trying to think what it was now. I think it was 2017 when I'd not long started there. And she flew, as I always used to put her legs, saying, with a hairdryer and a hanky across the Russian tundra, following 5 of our birds that were tagged, but essentially following the entire flock that they were making their way west. Because what she wanted to find out was, what are these birds facing? If you think about it, in the last, I don't know, 100 years, the terrain that the birds have to face as they come further west is changed dramatically. For hundreds of thousands of years even, they've essentially followed the same route, which has been unchanged. So it's been Russian tundra, Russian woodlands, moving to less woodland, and then moving to green areas and wooded areas, but basically making their way across Europe to move west to get ahead of the bad weather, and knowing their places to stop. And in fact, with Buick swans, they bring their young with them. They have to teach their young that route. It's not something that they inherently know. They're not like a mallard duck where it's they just know where they need to go. Buicks need to be shown that. So as humans have changed the landscapes with airports and power lines and towns and cities and runways, and they've filled in water sources and filled up lakes and wetlands and estuaries, or reclaimed estuaries, that landscape has changed dramatically for them. So one of the things Sasha wanted to do was see how they are coping with that. She also wanted to see what other hazards they were coming up against. And one of the things that became very clear from Sasha's travels was just how serious a threat power lines are for Buick swans. We knew anecdotally that Buicks were hitting power lines. We'd seen evidence of this, but she stopped at a lot of the places along this flyway, and was able to speak to people and to schools and to say, what are you seeing? And they're saying that we know that Buicks are hitting power lines. So we've been working with a few of the governments along the flyway of the Buicks, and good old Estonia, little Estonia, the first government to respond to this really started putting up the flickers on power lines really quickly. You would have seen that in this country sometimes there's a big red ball or a flicker on our power lines, but they are not all on the Buick Flyway yet. So that's something we really would like to address, because every Buick saved is turning things in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction for these birds. But is it making a difference? So last year, 21-22, was the best breeding season that we've had for Buick swans since 1966. Now, I don't want to make that sound better than it is really, because when you've got 20% of your Buicks on site are young, that's great news. But when you've got 600 birds, obviously 20% of that is 120 birds, something like that. That's a lot of birds. We have 20% this year are young, but it's 20% of 128 birds. So, you know, our numbers around 130, they were around 600 just 30 years ago. If we can turn that corner with better return of cygnets on site and, you know, and greater breeding success, then maybe the Buicks are just on turning a corner on trajectory back up in numbers. But I'm not in a position to say that yet. One of the things I do get asked about quite often is avian influenza. How is that affecting Buick numbers? It's a really difficult one to answer because we don't have any solid data really on this. What the government say is that birds that catch avian influenza die from it, and that's pretty much, you know, all birds. Having said that, in a turkey farm or a chicken farm, they all get put to sleep anyway, so you know they are killed because they've got infected. Talking to Dave Painter, you saw in one of those earlier pictures doing putting the swans in swan jackets. I was asking him about this only a few weeks ago, saying, you know, are Buicks catching avian influenza, and what's happening on our side? And his view was, and I trust Dave Painter immensely, he's got 44 years of experience working with our birds. What he said to me was, last year, 21-22, I remember seeing this family. We had a family of 2 adults and 5 cygnets. It was incredible, you know, just to have that many birds successful with one family. He said to me, I am convinced all 7 of those birds caught avian influenza. They had all of the symptoms. They were going around in circles. They were, you know, their necks were floppy. He said they just had every sign of AI, but we didn't want to catch them because we didn't want to stress them out. Only one of those birds died. So, you know, who knows? If there is some evidence, and we're putting this together quite quietly, if there is any evidence that birds are surviving avian influenza, and that's brilliant. But we also know that some species are absolutely being obliterated by this, and I'm sure you all know about barnacle geese in Scotland. Last year, I think it was 38% of them died during the winter outbreak of AI, and of course it hasn't left the country this year. It's carried on all through the summer and into this winter. So avian influenza, I don't want to talk too much about it because it's not my field of expertise, but I just want to say it may be there is some hope for some species. Changing tack completely, I'm going to go to another part of the world with the Madagascar pochard. This is an absolutely amazing story. I built an exhibit around this bird 2 years ago, and as a result of that became quite passionate about its survival. And also I was really lucky because of working on managing the National Lottery project. I was able to make a film about them as well, which I can't show you tonight because it's 15 minutes long, but maybe I'll talk with Jeff by email after tonight, and if you want to see it, I'll send it out to you. It's supposed to be just for our use, but it's such a lovely film. I think if you want to see it, it's only 15 minutes. But the story of the Madagascar pochard all starts in Madagascar. So this is it's a massive island. I think it's the 4th largest island in the world. It broke off from the coast of Africa about 135 million years ago, and you'll all know that the species on Madagascar have evolved independently of the mainland for all of that time, and so many species on Madagascar are unique. One of the things we think about probably most commonly when we think about Madagascar are lemurs. I think it's 33 species of lemur. Don't quote me on that, because this isn't my specialist subject, but I think it's 33. And of course, you know, thanks to lots of wonderful wildlife programs, we normally think about this as being an island absolutely, you know, stuffed with wildlife and with you know, animals swinging through the trees, lush vegetation. The reality of Madagascar is very different. This is a country with 20 million people. Nearly all of them live off the land in some way or another. And so slash and burn is very common there, to clear land for farming and for rice fields. And so these days, only about 4% of that wonderful forest remains. And sadly, the wetlands are in an even worse state, because where the forest has been cut down, there's been loads of runoff. Wetlands have become silted up. Where they've done lots of planting, they've also become poisoned with insecticides. And to top it all, in order to get fish growth to happen really quickly, many lakes in Madagascar have been filled with carp, stocked with carp, which grow very quickly, eat everything, destroy all the natural habitat, and then periodically those carp are stripped out about every 3 or 4 years to provide food, basically. So again, just like the Russian hunters, this isn't land that's being destroyed for sport or for anything insidious. It's being destroyed because people are desperate to feed themselves. But the consequence of that is habitats have been destroyed, and the wildlife that live on them have been destroyed along with it. I'm going to go back, sorry, picture. So what's the story of the Madagascar pochard? In fact, I'm going to go back 2 pictures and show you the Madagascar pochard. So the story of this bird is that in the 1960s, 1970s, it was abundant in number. You know, I mean, tens of thousands abundant in the sort of midland area of Madagascar. By 1991, the very last male of the species had died in a Madagascar zoo. So that was it, finito, extinct. People had looked for the bird. It's very rare for an animal to be declared extinct without a very long period of time passing, because just in case one gets found in the wild, or a pair or something. But this was acknowledged as very likely extinct, and this went on from 1991 till 2006, when a group from the Peregrine Trust, there are lots of conservation organisations working in Madagascar, the Peregrine Trust were there not looking for Madagascar pochard, they were looking for Madagascar peregrine and Madagascar hawk, but somebody from that group spotted what they thought was this bird, which is a Madagascar pochard. They sent us images. We felt they could be right, and we would have got there in a heartbeat if it hadn't been for the fact that there was then a government coup in Madagascar, followed by an outbreak of plague, and we could not get there. For 2 years, we couldn't get there. In order to watch what was happening with the potential for this bird to not be extinct, we had local scouts on the ground who were watching the lake where they'd been found. Now, to say a little bit about the lake, I said that their traditional territory is sort of the middle span across Madagascar. These suspected Madagascar pochard were found in a lake about 280 kilometers north of there, in a very deep volcanic crater lake. And sadly, over those 2 years, whilst we had scouts watching them, what they were able to tell us, that it was likely that there were 5 or 6 females, likely that it was about 12 to 18 males. But it was also certain that whilst clutches were being born, every single duckling was not surviving. There was a survival rate of 0, and that was mainly because of 2 reasons. One we know about for sure, which is they were being predated by Madagascar hawk, which is also critically endangered. And then the other thing we have very large suspicion on is that this lake was too big for these diving ducks to feed. As an adult, they could just about reach the bottom. As young, with that huge buoyancy from those soft downy feathers, they didn't have a chance. So if they weren't predated, they were certainly starving to death. So that's 2006. By 2008, we've managed to get to Madagascar. Do look at the film. We will send you the film, and do have a look at it, because it's extraordinary. It's a tale of daring do, and we got basically all our kit got impounded in Kenya in a storm. We end up on Madagascar with no equipment. We managed to make it across the island by the skin of our teeth, get to this lake in order to try and collect eggs. We knew that there was a clutch there. When we arrived there late because of the delays in Kenya, we see the ducklings are just being predated, and I've got film that, in fact, it might even be in the film I'll send you, of these being picked off by Madagascar hawk. It was desperate. We'd arrived literally 3 hours too late. We then went to the nest to pick up the shells to get DNA, to find a complete clutch in the nest. It was a different nest that had hatched, incredibly, one that nobody knew about. So basically raised those ducklings in the middle of nowhere using their drinking water and those big sort of carry cases that you put your sandwiches in, they're insulated when you have a picnic, raising them in these insulated carry cases, managed to get them back to the main city because we needed water and we needed power to incubate them and to, you know, keep them clean and get them in fresh water because they're a diving duck. And then got hit by bandits who realized there was something precious at the hotel. So anyway, lots of daring do, and travel across Madagascar is impossible because there's hardly any roads. But after several false starts, we did manage to get these 6 eggs hatched. We managed to get them to safety outside of the capital city and set up a breeding program. And over the next 4 to 6 years managed to raise 200 Madagascar pochard, and they are absolutely Madagascar pochard, because of course there was lots of suspicion that they might be interbred or might not be the bird we thought they were, but they were absolutely Madagascar pochard, which is amazing. So gone from extinct to 200 in captivity. But we are, just going back to this picture, we're a wetland conservation organization. We don't do keep things to keep it in a zoo. So we wanted to find a place in the wild in Madagascar where they could be released. We managed to find this lake, which is Lake Sophia. It was in terrible condition. The people living on it had overfished it, overpolluted it, but it was the best lake of 30 in Madagascar that we could find. So we started work on it. And working on it meant working with the people who live there. I said that this is a really poor country. These are not people who are destroying their environment for anything other than desperation. So we've been working with the fishermen there now for, this is our 11th year, helping them to restock and, you know, to plant places where the fish fry can start to develop, to use bigger nets, which takes a big step from local people who are already hungry to say, well, you can't catch little fish, please try and catch bigger ones, but we'll support you through that. And we did. And we've also been working very extensively with local farmers to improve their rice crop using different rice that needs far less pesticides in order to grow, far less toxin going into the waterways. What we now have is the 14,000 people who live on this lake are living a better life. They actually have some food surplus. We've even given bicycles to people so they can get food surplus stocks to market. And as a consequence of that, they are helping to protect the Madagascar pochard, or this new habitat that we've been developing for Madagascar pochard. So what we've done is, we saw the picture from above, and you might have seen these sort of strange setups on it. What we did was constructed the world's first floating aviaries so we could release some Madagascar pochard onto this lake. This happened in 2018, the first release. The reason they're in these floating aviaries is because we needed them to get used to their environment before they went properly feral. And inside that you can see something that looks a bit like Darth Vader's helmet. This is because during the breeding process, everything that we fed them with was black and white, because we knew at some point they'd have to go wild, but there's not enough food in this lake, even now, actually, for them to survive completely in the wild. So the birds, 21 birds were put into these floating aviaries. After 2 weeks, they were released. We knew that if they flew away, they'd die for sure, because there certainly was nowhere else they were going to feed. And they did fly away. And a bit like some of you will remember the Falklands War, when the airplanes flew out of Port Stanley, or flew out off one of our aircraft carrier, and they were all counted back. There was a famous news broadcast about it. The same with these birds. 21 birds flew off, and by the end of the day 21 had flown back. They now live pretty much wild on that lake, where they are topped up with food regularly, about every 3 days. But amazingly, I remember sitting at my desk in December 2019 and getting this picture through, which was, Jackie, you won't believe it, they've been released under a year. We have 12 ducklings born on Lake Sophia. And it really was, I put on there, it felt like a miracle, didn't it ever? 3 of those 12 ducklings survived to adulthood. So you know what, that's a pretty, that would be equivalent to any other bird born in the wild, really, any other duckling. So a success. We still have birds in captivity in Madagascar. I don't think they will ever leave the island. There's no intention for them to go anywhere else in the world. It is the only place that they exist. But that work on Lake Sophia continues to improve that lake for people and for wildlife. And that's really the key. We have to improve it for people and for wildlife. So that's the Madagascar pochard story. I'm just looking at the time. I'm going to go on for another 10 minutes. So Jeff, is that okay with you?
That's fine, Jackie. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. So Eurasian curlew, I'm going to keep this one simple because actually, although it's our home species, it's probably the one of these birds that I know least about. But Eurasian curlew, we've got 25% of the world's population of Eurasian curlew in the UK. But that's 25% of an increasingly depleting number. So since 1970, Eurasian curlew have fallen by 2/3, by 65%. So a quarter of just the 1/3 remaining is a small number. And the reason, there's multiple reasons for their decline, but to be fair, I think it would be, there are lots of organisations who want to turn that around. But because these are long-lived birds, the longest known Eurasian curlews live to 32. They live to 10 to 12 years in the wild. Because they're long-lived birds, it's harder to spot that there's a problem because the adults are still around for a long time. But their problem is essentially with their breeding. So poor old fox. I'm going to say turn it over to poor old crow as well. So crows, foxes, badgers, we know that there seems to be a bigger than normal problem with predation of eggs and young of curlew than there used to be. This is also true of the next bird I'm going to speak about, which is spoonbill sandpiper. That could be because as there are fewer nests and fewer young, then the predators have a bigger hit on what's left. But there could be other reasons for that, and we're looking into that. But we know they're being predated. The other problem, and I come from a farming family, is the pressing need basically to have as many cuts of hay a year as you can possibly manage, because hay has a financial value. So it used to be if you got 2 cuts a year, you'd be quite happy with that. 3 was astonishing, whereas now farmers frequently get 4 cuts, which is great, except this is a bird that ground nests. And of course, if the eggs aren't being smashed, then because the cut is that soon, which it often is, then it's likely that the young are being basically cut down before they're able to fly. So back in 2018, 2019, we became part of a national efforts to turn around the what's happening with the curlews, to try and increase their numbers again. And that was mostly, we know, about trying to improve their survival rates for their young. We took some eggs from an RAF base in the east of England, 2 RAF bases actually. These were 2 bases where curlew eggs were very common on the RAF sites, but they were collecting the eggs and smashing them because what they didn't want was young curlew flying up into expensive equipment. So in 2019, we took 54 eggs from RAF bases, brought them back to Slimbridge to head start them, which is essentially give them a head start so that they get properly incubated without predators, with all the feed they need in very safe conditions, with the aim of releasing them on the Severn and Avon Vales, which are in Gloucestershire. Of those 54 eggs, amazingly, we managed to raise 50. Given this is the first year we'd done anything like this with curlew, we really didn't know, what the specifics of raising curlew would be, and it is very different for every bird. to raise 50 was astonishing. And those are all ringed and released on the Severn and Avon areas. In fact, there's a picture of Sparky. Sparky was actually also one of the people on that Madagascar trip who collected those first eggs, but a very proud dad there. We've got only a very, very small of conservation specialists, but they're so passionate about their work. I've obviously chucked that one in to give you a baby picture. And there's another baby picture, because you wouldn't want those. What we now know from our work along the Severn Vale is that of those birds, we've tracked them, so we know what their flyway is. We've had some success, very limited success, with some of them actually staying and breeding or coming back after they've met other partners and coming back to breed. We're now spreading that work to Dartmoor, where we're working on the Duchy of Cornwall's estate, just outside Princetown, to really try and re-wet parts of Dartmoor to make it suitable for curlew as a good habitat. And we've done similar head starting, giving those eggs a chance to grow, to at least fledge, and then release them on site. And we've done that for the last 2 years with the hope that we can improve the conditions on Dartmoor as well as on the Severn for breeding curlews. This is for those ones released on the Severn. We had 5 of them. That shows the flyways of 5 of them, just so you know where we are tracking. They are quite, they have tended to stay quite local, really, in curlew terms. This is Tom, the curlew, also called AT. He was one of the Severn ones that actually managed to raise 4 eggs to adulthood. And one of the other things that we do now with the curlew is we've got drones that are monitoring fields from the air, so we can see hotspots, which helps us to locate nests. And when we find a nest, we then put this predator, you can probably see that fencing, predator control fencing around it, to give the young half a chance before they get nobbled by foxes and badgers. Unfortunately, that fencing doesn't keep the crows out. So that's a little bit about the curlew, and that really is current work in progress. But my last story is this little bird, spoonbill sandpiper. This is a bird which does this amazingly long migration. So that green area around the Chamchatka and Chukotka area of Russia is where they breed in the winter, and then they fly 5,000 miles, 8,000 kilometers to their wintering grounds, which is the purple bit in Thailand, Myanmar and Bangladesh. And when I say they, I'm talking about 100 pairs maximum. So there, I saw a Birds Russia report in 1993 that said the spoonbill sandpipers of least concern, probably 12,000 pairs. We can't see any dangers on the horizon. By 2008, it was massive concern, 200 pairs, reducing by 28% a year. Urgent action needed. This species is about to become extinct for all kinds of reasons. On their flyway, on that big yellow mark there, just where the flyway crosses land between China and Japan, is a huge wetland area. It's a natural wetland. The birds have to stop at multiple places along that flyway, but that's one of their most vital stopover points. But 50% of that wetland has now been developed. In human terms, we call it reclaiming. In animal terms, I'd call it absolute destruction. So the birds haven't got places to rest as they used to have. But the other thing that's happening for them, just like the curlew on their Russian wintering grounds, they're definitely being predated in a more severe way, possibly because there are so few of them. So when you've got an army of skewers marching across the Russian tundra looking for food, any nest is very, very vulnerable. And the other thing is in their wintering grounds I think I got the summer and winter. They breed in the summer in Russia, and then they fly to those purple areas for their wintering. And when they get there, people are so poor and are living so hand to mouth that they have now moved from fishing, which is depleted, to netting birds for food. They're not netting spoonbill sandpipers, because spoonbill sandpipers are tiny, but the spoonies get caught as bycatch. So we're working on several fronts. One is trying to improve breeding in Russia. Again, the last 3 years, that's been impossible. Another is really 60 organizations across that flyway, including the Chinese and South Korean governments, trying to stop development on those rest areas, so there is a place for these birds to rest over on that big flyway. And then on their wintering grounds where people are catching them as bycatch for catching other birds, we're trying to work with communities on the ground to find another way for them to make a living. But with those 60 partners, it was Slimbridge who took up the mantle of trying to raise spoonies in captivity. We managed with 30 birds, which is an extraordinary number. We had 13 live birds brought to us and then 17 eggs, which we managed to raise young from. And since 2010, we've had a breeding program at Slimbridge. It's been extraordinarily difficult. I think the ambition was that we would raise birds, release them in the wild, and that would start to top up the wild population. But raising these birds has been an extraordinarily difficult process, and I could spend an entire hour going through that with you. But these are birds that are the size of a bumblebee when they're hatched. We knew nothing about how to manage all of the things that get them to the position where they'll breed. So on a 5,000-mile flyway, daylight changes, temperature changes, their food changes it twice because they fly, you know, to Thailand and back again. Managing all of that to get the birds in a position where they want to mate, and then matching them up in a way that they would want to mate with the birds we put them with, and then raising those tiny, tiny eggs and all the challenges of that. We have managed to raise 5 birds, but everything we've learned has gone to helping us work on the ground in Russia, where we've been collecting eggs. And this is a typical spoonie nest, very difficult to see in 100,000 square miles of Russian tundra, but we have had our techniques for doing it. But then once they're collected in Russia, we've been working more successfully in Russia until the last 5 years, till the last 3 years, to head start them on the ground and then raise them and put them in these polytunnels until they're ready to fly. The position with spoonies is still absolutely desperate. I've been very privileged to work with them over the last year. We've only got 2 left at Slimbridge. They're both males. They're still very precious because they are so rare, and we still don't know even how old they live. But we also know that at the moment there is nobody working on the ground in Russia to pursue this work. And okay, you know, of course we all have to understand that there's a war going on and we can't send money to Russia because the chances of it getting to this particular project are very slim. But somewhere along the line, you know, let's hope all of these things soon get resolved, because, you know, species and entire habitats are being destroyed whilst we're all sleeping or looking elsewhere at other problems. And finally, you'll be glad to know, I could talk for England. This is just 4 species out of the many, many we work with. And essentially we're working with these species because it's the habitats that they live on that we're, you know, by looking at the species, we can work to improve the habitats. And by improving those habitats, then we get to improve those habitats for the thousands of other species that depend on them. On that flyway in from northern Russia to Bangladesh, there are 50 million migratory birds. They all need that flyway to be in good condition. And lastly, wetlands really are that rare thing. It's a solution to flooding, to drought, to carbon capture, and our health and well-being, as well as all the wonderful nature that depends on it. So I hope that you will get the sense of, as I certainly do, that what we do is amazing, and we've got to continue it. So that's enough from me, but I'm going to hand over to Jeff because I think he's going to now steward the question session.
I shall indeed, Jackie. Thanks for that. As you mentioned, really nice focus on 4 species, but with the wider implications much more broadly. Got a couple of questions, and there's time for people to put in more if they want to in the Q&A, please. The first one is around the way, the fact you started the talk with about salt marshes capturing so much carbon. What gives rise to that? Why is that compared to trees?
I can explain a bit about that. So essentially, what's happening where there are, start again, Jackie. The Severn, the River Severn, has got the 2nd highest tidal range in the world. So this new salt marsh that we've been working on in North Somerset was essentially a flood alleviation plan on the part of the Environment Agency. And we got involved to say, don't just build seawalls and stop water coming in, actually manage the water coming in to develop a really good habitat for wildlife and develop some salt marsh. Now, I don't think even we knew quite what that would end up looking like and how well that would work. But with salt marsh, I don't know if you can see me. But we've got channels that we've dug in around this part of Somerset, is around Steart Marshes, that every day when the Severn tide comes, it fills it with water twice a day. But the Severn has exceptionally high tides as well, so all of the land around it floods as well, very, very frequently actually. When that happens, the Severn dumps a whole rack of mud on top of grass and insects and invertebrate, and that gets trapped forever. And that's the carbon that gets trapped, because once that mud is on top, that carbon stays there extraordinarily. I know this from some work I did at Slimbridge. If you were to dig out 1 square meter of Severn mud to 2.5 centimeters deep, there's the equivalent calorific value of 16 Mars bars. Essentially, that's 16 Mars bars worth of carbon, because that's, you know, all food is carbon in some way or another. So that's the rate at which carbon gets trapped, and that's why salt marsh in particular is very effective at storing carbon.
Thank you. And that comparison of estuarine silt with numbers of Mars bars is the most creative analogy I've.
And it does look like mashed up Mars bars.
Brilliant. I'm not sure quite how to follow that, but anyway. Turning to the Madagascan pochard, why have there not been efforts to try and breed that outside Madagascar?
I think there's increasingly a push to make sure that we raise species where they belong, and if we can't raise them and keep them in the wild, then there's, if we try and focus, any organization tries to focus on just keeping a species alive in a zoo, then we've kind of failed on everything really, apart from having something we can go and gawk at now and then. So for us and for our work with international, other international partners, the focus has been on saving this bird at home where it's supposed to be. It's certainly true that Peter Scott would have loved to have had a pair of Madagascar pochard, and in fact I remember talking to David Attenborough. I was very happy to meet him once on site, and he was saying that when he was young, and Peter Scott was saying to him, there's a real big problem with conservation across the world, but I still want 2 Madagascar pochard, and I know you're going out there soon. And he was supposed to have brought a pair back for Scott and forgot. So yeah, we would have had a pair breeding at Slimbridge, but now we just want to make sure that they can live in the wild.
Absolutely, thank you. Couple of questions relating to curlew. You mentioned using thermal cameras and drones. How much success have you had with that? Because I guess it's quite a challenging thing to achieve. Yeah,
we only started doing it last summer, and we had, I think was it 13 or 18 volunteers out looking for nests in the Severn area, so we could see how well that release had gone and whether there were any birds coming back and breeding. We have had some success with heat. It's basically drones that can spot heat sources in the grass, but of course there are loads of other things that could be in the grass that are producing that heat source. So we really have to, it's an aid, but it's not the whole solution. But it just certainly has helped us find a couple of nests, and when numbers are very small, then that counts. It's worth doing.
Okay, I'm sticking with curlew. I don't know if you noticed, but the curlew is the emblem of Wildfowl naturalists. And
you know what? Did I see that? I'm not even sure I've had that, but that's amazing. Well, I'm glad I spoke about them.
Yeah.
Now I'm worried because I don't know very much about them.
Oh, well, okay. I'll try this one with you. There's a curlew conservation project up in Nidderdale, just north of the Wildfowl naturalist area in West Yorkshire. And one of the comments people have been concerned about there in trying to survey and understand more about curlews is how bright corvids are in finding nests, particularly if you mark them. So, if you're going to put posts up near them, that would be a no-no. But even the thought that electric fences around nests, there's a trade-off of stopping ground predators, but maybe giving the corvids a clue as to where they should be looking. Is that something? Is it real?
You know what? I don't know. Nobody's raised that with me. Although when I did say when we put the fences up, it doesn't stop the crows getting in, and they are, as we all know, they're one of the smartest birds. So I don't know what the experience is in Yorkshire on that. And certainly we monitor everything to make sure we're, if you win on one front, what you don't want to do is lose on another. So we do monitor everything, but I'm not aware of that being one of our higher level concerns on our work anyway.
Sure, thank you. Now, we're fortunate to have good numbers, but the same concerns about the breeding success rate here. Many people know I'm quite a rewilder, so I do like the thought of more goshawks and maybe one day eagles to control the corvids a bit.
Absolutely,
wading birds.
The natural balance of things. We muck it up, and then we're really surprised when it's mucked up as a species.
As we stand, the last question is maybe a slightly strange one, but does anyone know the reason why the spoonbill sandpiper has a spoonbill?
No, they don't. I sometimes say that is one of the first things. I've spoken to lots of people about this, including people who've spoken to all the experts around the world, and we are some of the best experts. There is no clear reason or no clear ecological or
adaptation
why they have a spatulated beak. It's hard to understand how that can give any kind of advantage in terms of evolution. So I don't know.
Maybe just a chance one that didn't cause any detriment.
Well, maybe.
So the last one then is just around options where there is heavy predation. Predator control, is that practiced to a degree? I mean, pragmatically, I guess it needs to be, but how practical is it in many of the cases?
Yeah, so because this can be across the world, of course. I mean, if I think about the spoonies, the chances of there being any predator control in northern Russia is non-existent. Not only is it skuas, it's also bears, Arctic fox, ground squirrels. It's all kinds of things are eating the eggs there. In Madagascar, for the Madagascar pochard, the difficulty there is that the predators are in as perilous a state of nearing extinction as the pochard are. To see a Madagascar hawk snatch a pochard, for somebody studying Madagascar hawk, I'm sure they'd be cheering that it got some food. For us, it was, dreadful. For curlew, I think the curlew, where there's lots of efforts, isn't there, to manage those predators in this country for other reasons. Whether it's having any kind of impact, I don't know. We are definitely watching trying to look at why it is that predators seem to be so much more successful with curlew eggs and other ground laying eggs, birds as well. I'm not answering that question because I don't know the answer.
No, that's fine. I'm not sure anybody knows the answer, but yeah, we're all trying different routes and see what we can achieve. That concludes the questions. So thanks ever so much, Jackie. I'll hand you back to Helen, who will sum up.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jackie, for a really, really fascinating talk. Thought it was such a lovely idea to do it through the 4 species and tell those 4 very different stories. The only one I'd really I sort of recognised in any sense was the Buick swans, because I've been to Slimbridge, and those pictures of the family tree of swans is just incredible. I mean, it struck me that we don't really have that for wild creatures in anything like that kind of detail. I mean, you have it for pedigree dogs, pedigree horses and things, but to have it for wild swans is just absolutely fascinating. So I really love that story, and I really want to see this Madagascar pochard film. I mean, it sounds like it's worthy of a feature film, let alone a 15-minute film with the bandits and the the officials impounding all your equipment in Kenya, and what an incredible story that was. So I hope some of it really comes across in the 15-minute film. I'm dying to see it, and if it doesn't, make the feature is what I would say. Thank you so much, Jackie. I also just wanted to mention a couple of the sort of more theoretical ideas that you got across to me. One was the incredible importance of the flyway, and how a sort of thoughtless bit of building and development in a crucial place can be fatal to the chances of numerous species that use that flyway. I mean, I suppose it's an obvious point, but it really did bring it home to hear what's happened to the spoonbill sandpipers in such a small amount of time, really, just because of that development. And And the other thing that I wanted to mention was, I mean, you entitled your talk, Saving Wetlands for Wildlife and People. And I had thought that probably, I mean, usually when we talk in the UK about nature for people, we're thinking about, you know, mental health and how good it is for us to be in nature. And perhaps that is part of what you meant. But you also showed this other aspect, which is that, of course, when people need land for food, need animals for food, need vegetation for food, you can't expect people to be able to preserve things like wetlands unless they are helped to do so by people who've got the resources to help. And I thought that was a really, really powerful message, and really made me think much more about how interconnected, you know, poverty is with the fate of these creatures in those countries. So thank you again, Jackie, for an incredibly thought-provoking talk. Just a couple of final announcements. The next meeting, I believe, is on March the 14th. That's going to be our recorders evening. Please do come along. It's always a fantastic evening. Hear what some of our recorders have been looking at and recording. I've just seen from Jeff's slides. Thank you, Jeff. We're going to have weather, we're going to have butterflies, we're going to have mammals, and we're going to have birds. So please do come along on the 14th and hear about those. And just to repeat what I said at the very beginning of the talk about the Bempton Cliffs trip, that's Thursday, the 23rd of March. I'm sure the birds will be returning there in numbers by the end of March. So so that should be a great trip as well. Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks once again to Jackie for delivering such a fascinating talk, and hope to see some of you at the recorders evening. Bye.